Kai, the hippie hitchhiker, shot to viral fame after a quirky, outrageous, and charming interview by the local news after saving a woman's life by swinging his hatchet at her attacker. For 3 months, Kai was a celebrated hero. Even Jimmy Kimmel invited him onto his show to show the world that even the kookiest characters can save lives. But just 3 months later, Kai, the nation's favorite walking meme, would be in prison for murder. How does a man go from saving a woman's life to taking another in the most brutal way imaginable? What drove this happy-go-lucky character to commit the ultimate sin? Here's the story of Kai, the Hatchet Hitchhiker. Let's get into it. For this iconic interview, he wasn't always Kai, the most joyful homeless man, was actually born Caleb Lawrence McGillivary on September 3, 1988, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, to parents Shirley Stromberg and Gil McGillivary. There are 3 separate versions of Kai's early life. Kai's take on it, his mother's accounts, and the version that his father has. Unfortunately, Kai's version of events is rather, well, unbelievable. There's no doubt that his early life was rife with trauma and instability, but it's highly unlikely that a lot of what he says happened truly did. Kai claims that his parents sexually abused him. He recalls memories from his own crib as a baby and that he was raised in a religious cult that abused children regularly by starvation, confinement, and physical torture. Not only can the cult and parental abuse claims not be corroborated, his recollections appear to be from before the age of 2. So like I said, there's a lot here that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. What his parents did confirm was that they divorced when Kai was 4 and that was the start of his behavioral struggles. He was confined to care facilities for a large part of his teenage years. Though other than describing him as having severe behavioral issues, his parents have never quite been clear about what he had done to justify sending a 13-year-old to an institution. His mother cites ADHD as the reason. But there was obviously a great deal going on in Kai's mind that the system took care of him until he turned 18. Kai claims that he was severely abused in these facilities too, both sexually and physically. His father did admit that he rarely saw Kai and that he always felt that Kai resented him for starting a new family and for not coming to save him from his prison. Gil believes that Kai did suffer some level of abuse at these facilities because once he was institutionalized, his mind started to fracture even more. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. Given these clinical diagnoses, especially the PTSD, there must have been some traumatic event in Kai's formative years, but which of his claims it was, or even all of them, maybe none of them at all, it's hard to tell. I realize that these descriptions are vague at best, but neither parent seems to be willing to really disclose what kind of kid Kai was, and Kai's version of events is constantly changing. But it should be clear that there were definitely some serious mental illnesses here that weren't being treated. From the outside, it looks like Kai was dumped in an institution because no one quite knew how to handle him. When he turned 18 and aged out of the system, Kai was let loose with virtually no medical support and complete estrangement from both his parents. People describe him as a joyous, energetic fellow, that his mind was always working at 1,000 miles a minute. He wasn't just intelligent, he was creative and kind. Exactly like the free-spirited hippie we first saw that earned him a spot in the viral Hall of Fame. But Kai wasn't always just a ball of love and joy. Sometimes he turned morose, dark, and even mean if he weren't left alone during these times. There are records of Kai being charged with 2 misdemeanors in Canada, but since those occurred while he was underage, there's no telling what he'd done. For all we know, it could have been something as inconspicuous as sleeping on a park bench or as serious as robbing someone. There's just no way to tell. He definitely finished high school and even took a few college classes, but Kai decided to pack a backpack and hit the road on his own before he turned 19. He did return on occasion to visit his parents, but the visits only lasted a few days and he'd be off again. He started to refer to himself as home free instead of homeless, and started to call himself Kai from Dogtown, referring to the fact that he considered himself to have no family, no home, and no people to tie him down. The quintessential drifter without a care in the world and only good vibes to pass along to anyone he ran into. He became a registered member of the First Nations indigenous people after attending a retreat where he found some kind of spiritual connection with the earth, and if he ever needed money, Kai'd whip out his guitar and sing for change.
Just fine.
They just almost ran over and thought that
from the got my greatest hits from the hits from the hits from the ball. Hits from the bomb. Hits from the bomb. Inhale, exhale.
In February of 2013, Kai was in Fresno, hitching rides as usual, and he caught a lift with Jeff Simmons McBride, a 300-pound madman who went on a tirade of confessions while they drove. He told Kai that he'd assaulted a 14-year-old girl, that he was Jesus reincarnated, and that there was going to be a terrorist attack at the Super Bowl soon. McBride was a nutcase, all right, and a dangerous one at that. He crashed the car into a utility truck, nearly killing the driver. Kai could have fled from the car, but instead, he jumped out to help the utility worker who was now pinned between McBride's car and the utility truck. Two pedestrians, both women, also came to assist, and that's when McBride attacked one of them. He grabbed her up in a bear hug while shouting that he was Jesus and that the Illuminati were after him and tried to kiss the woman. Kai took the hatchet from his travel pack and started wailing on McBride. Hero mode activated. He used the butt end of the hatchet because he genuinely didn't want to hurt McBride, but like Kai later explained, the beast of a guy would have snapped her like a twig. When this didn't work, Kai had no choice but to hit McBride with the blade end, resulting in a pretty significant wound and enough to force McBride to let the woman go. And here's where the internet fell in love with Kai. A field reporter conducted the now famous interview. Music. This hippy-dippy drifter who just saved a woman's life melted the public's hearts with his kooky interview. They called him the Hatchet Wielding Hitchhiker, and TV stations were clamoring to get their own zany interview with him. One even offered him a reality TV show of his very own, but Kai turned them all down. He only agreed to go on Jimmy Kimmel for a skit and then hit the road again. If you were wondering what happened to McBride, he got sentenced to a psychiatric facility after he pleaded guilty to all of the charges. McBride was not mentally well and probably still isn't. Well, his leg isn't doing great. Kai's hatchet hit him in the thigh and caused permanent damage, leaving McBride wheelchair-bound for a few months. For the next few months, Kai got by on his minor celebrity status. When people recognized him, they offered him a ride or a place to sleep. Unfortunately, this constant attention also revealed his mental instabilities. He shouted profanities and racial slurs at anyone who'd listen. He made women uncomfortable by catcalling them or following them around and just generally made a nuisance of himself wherever he went. Some thought it was a bid for attention, to make the fame last for as long as it could. Others recognized the deeply unstable individual who wasn't handling the pressure well. What came when Kai got a massive face tattoo and went on a social media tirade about giving single mothers shotguns so that they could protect themselves, and urinated in public places more often than even your average bum. Somehow, this joyride of mounting unhinged behavior led him to New York in May of 2013, where he met 73-year-old lawyer Joseph Galfy in Times Square. Galfy was a pretty big deal in the New Jersey community, where he was still a partner in a pretty significant law firm. Galfy had no knowledge about who Kai was and just offered the cheerful drifter a ride and a place to sleep for the night. A lot of people question Galfy's actions here. I mean, who picks up an obviously homeless man in Times Square if they didn't have some alternate intentions with the person? But honestly, for all his faults, Kai has always been a likable guy. Sure, he's a little strange and kooky, and he jumps from one subject to the next like a squirrel on caffeine, but that's part of his charm. I can totally see how he could get by like this with just his infectious joy to fuel others to take him in from time to time. Now, the next series of events comes from Kai, so let's just keep an open mind for the time being. Kai reported that they went to Galfy's home in Clark, where they drank a few beers and had dinner. Kai soon started experiencing an overwhelming exhaustion, so he retreated to the guest bedroom where he passed out. The next morning, Kai woke up to find what he thought to be drool on his cheek, wiped it off, and waited all day for a friend to pick him up. Unfortunately, his friend bailed on him, never showing up. Galfy offered him the guest room for another night, which Kai happily accepted. But the same thing happened again. They had dinner, a few beers, and Kai was hit with an extreme sense of exhaustion. He passed out in his bedroom, but woke up later that night to find himself in Galfy's room with Galfy on top of him, in the middle of what was clearly a very violent sexual assault. Kai responded by fighting Galfy off of him, using only his fists and feet, kicking and punching his way out of the room before grabbing his bag and fleeing from the residence in the late hours of Sunday night or the early hours of Monday morning. Kai came to the conclusion that he'd been drugged both nights and that the drool he had on his cheek on Sunday morning wasn't drool at all, but instead was some other kind of DNA from Galfy, if you catch my drift. After fleeing the home, Kai went about his business as usual, catching rides and posting alarming messages on social media about being sexually assaulted. Galfy was found a day later in his bedroom, dressed only in his underwear and very clearly deceased. He'd been beaten to death. His ribs were fractured and one of his ears was almost completely torn off. This was very obviously an extremely violent attack. It didn't take long to track down Kai. There were numerous messages between him and Galfy, all relatively mundane. But the evidence was clear from those texts that Kai was staying there for at least 2 nights. He was arrested at a bus stop in Philly 3 days after the murder. It took nearly 6 years before this case ever reached trial. And here's where I start siding with Kai. Everything leading up to 2013 showed that Kai was well-meaning, but extremely unstable, and that he had mental conditions that weren't being treated properly. Lack of evidence in the case actually validates his claims. Kai said that he was never given a rape kit or any kind of examination by a medical professional after his arrest. He also states that no physical evidence was taken from Galfy's house at all. And by all accounts, this entire trial was based around Kai's confessions and the victim's injury. Almost no forensics was done on the apartment, and there are no records of it being searched either. Unfortunately, Kai's increasing mental instability didn't do well in court. He frequently went on screaming rants to the point that he had to be removed from the court, and he attempted to fire his lawyer so that he could represent himself instead. He accused his lawyer, the judge, and police of being part of a conspiracy. He was deemed mentally unfit to represent himself, but mentally fit to stand trial. So who's bipolar now? Looks like the judge from my perspective. Is Kai mentally unfit or is he not? You can't have it both ways, man. Look, I'm not one to bash the legal system if I don't have to. These guys are understaffed, underpaid, and underappreciated. But Kai's story actually checks out on the surface. Let's say he did wake up in the middle of a sexual assault. A man suffering from PTSD stemming from exactly this kind of assault would completely flip out, resulting in an incredibly unhinged, violent, and uncontrollable reason. That would explain the extreme nature of the attack. If he'd been given the rape kit and if the house got appropriately searched, they could have found drugs, DNA in the guest bedroom, DNA on Kai's clothes, or even injuries consistent with an assault still visible on Kai. As much of an unstable individual as Kai has proven himself to be, there is no sugarcoating the fact that he was denied a proper investigation. His lawyer was actually very good at unearthing the gaping holes in this whole investigation, not to mention highlighting the fact that Galfy had tons of friends in law enforcement, some of whom were directly involved with Kai's case, including the lead prosecutor. He presented evidence that police allowed Galfy's brother into the apartment before the crime scene was released, and the brother loaded the dishwasher and ran it, destroying any evidence of drug residue on the dishes. He removed evidence from the home too. This entire investigation was botched from the start, and it should never have been allowed to go to trial at all. And the lawyer did all this with his client shouting at him that he was a member of the Illuminati. Despite all of these alarming shortcuts and in-house buddy-buddy going on, Kai still got sentenced to 57 years in prison for murder. You might have been able to tell that I am not a fan of this sentence at all. First off, this case should have been chucked out, and every prosecutor, judge, and investigator should have been brought in instead. Secondly, Kai should have been given the appropriate medical care that he so clearly needs. And thirdly, Galfy should have been investigated appropriately too. I cannot tell you whether or not he's guilty. Personally, I'm on the fence about his part in all of this. And it's entirely possible that Kai reacted the way he did while in the middle of a full-blown psychotic episode, and Galfy might have been completely innocent. It doesn't change the fact that 3 months ago, Kai's first reaction to a violent situation was to protect a woman in danger with no regard for his own personal safety. That shows me that no matter how badly he needed help for some terribly debilitating mental conditions, Kai's first response was to do the right thing. I just don't think he had it in him to kill someone just for kicks. Kai's appealed his case numerous times, and despite his parents' attempts to reach out to him, he's decided not to accept their communications. After Netflix released a documentary of his life and his case in 2023, public interest peaked again, but no amount of appeals or public interest has been enough for Kai's case to get looked at again. That brings me to my final say on this whole affair. Kai needs proper help in a facility where there are people qualified to help him. And most of all, every single aspect of this investigation needs to be put under the microscope, including all of the characters in authority who were tied to Galfy, yet were somehow allowed to be involved with the investigation and trial. Whether Kai's guilty or not, the people in power abused the system, and that's a crime that needs to be brought to justice and proof that the system is broken beyond repair. But maybe I'm wrong about all of it, and Kai, the Hatchet Wielding Hitchhiker, was just a madman, a ticking time bomb waiting to happen. You know the drill by now. Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts. Like, subscribe, and do all the things. It's your engagement that allows this channel to be produced by humans for humans. And why not leave a few suggestions too? If there's a mystery or case that you're itching to have covered, let us know. We're always listening to your feedback. Until next time, cheers, people.